I have been in service to the Duke of Valthorpe for 18 years, and in all that time I have made only one mistake I am ashamed of. I made it slowly, over 7 years, in the form of a silence I should have broken on the very first day. Her name was Miss Opal Fenwick. She arrived at Valthorpe Hall in the autumn of the year the barley harvest failed, and the east drainage ditch took out 40 acres of winter wheat. She was 23 years old, the daughter of a village schoolmaster, and she carried under her arm a leather satchel worn smooth at the corners, and a letter of introduction from the vicar of Fenwick Cross that described her as possessed of an unusual facility with figures and a temperament admirably suited to quiet work. I read that letter standing in the servants' corridor and thought, good, we need a copying clerk. The previous one had been dismissed for filling in his ledger columns with creative optimism rather than actual numbers, and we were 3 months behind on the estate accounts. I gave Miss Fenwick a desk in the far corner of the estate office, a stack of quarterly reports to copy fair, and very little else by way of welcome. She thanked me, sat down, and was at work inside 4 minutes. She did not correct me that first day. She waited a full week. On the 8th morning, she set a page on my desk beside her fair copy and said, in a voice so composed it barely disturbed the air, Mr. Aldine, I believe there is a discrepancy in the October timber figures. The column total on page 4 does not match the sum of its entries. I have worked it 3 times. I may be wrong. She was not wrong. The error had been sitting there for 6 weeks. It would have cost the estate £47 at the next quarterly settlement if it had gone to the Duke's solicitor uncorrected. I thanked her and fixed the column and went back to my work and thought, privately, that we had found ourselves a rather good copying clerk. I was right about what she was. I was wrong about the word, rather. By the following spring, she had found 11 more errors, not in her own copies, but in the original reports, some of them years old, sitting in the bound volumes like quiet little disasters waiting to be opened. She brought them to me one at a time, always composed, always certain, always offering the caveat that she may be wrong, which she never was. By summer, she had reorganized the timber sale index so that cross-referencing a 5-year span, which had previously taken me the better part of an afternoon, took 11 minutes. I did not tell her it was extraordinary. I should have. I told myself she was simply efficient and moved on. In the 2nd year, she began writing the seasonal summaries. Not because I asked her to. I had mentioned one Tuesday in February that the winter summary was running late because I had 3 other reports to finish. She said nothing. The following Monday, the summary was on my desk, complete, clean, and correct to the last figure. It was better than mine. I knew it was better than mine because it would have taken me twice the time to produce half the clarity. I signed my name to the bottom and sent it to the Duke's solicitor. This is the mistake. Not a single act, but a repeated one, 18 times over 7 years. 18 reports, 18 summaries, 18 quarterly accounts. All in her hand, all carrying my name, all read by men who assumed they were mine. She never said a word about it. I told myself in those early years that she understood the arrangement, that a woman in a copying clerk's post had no expectation of attribution, that the work was what mattered, not the name. I told myself this with less conviction as the years passed, and with almost none at all by the 7th year, when it was no longer remotely accurate to call her a copying clerk, and I knew it. What she was, by the 7th year, was the reason Valthorpe Hall had not gone under. The estate had faced 3 serious financial pressures in those 7 years. The failed harvest I mentioned, a disputed land boundary that went to arbitration, and a steward's purchasing arrangement with a local timber merchant that turned out to be less favorable than advertised. In each case, it was Miss Fenwick who identified the risk first, calculated the exposure, proposed a remedy, and drafted the correspondence. In each case, the correspondence went out over my name. In each case, the Duke of Valthorpe reviewed the outcome, expressed satisfaction to me, and returned to the business of running a large estate, which for Lord Edric Valthorpe meant inspecting his tenants, managing his parliamentary obligations, and holding everyone around him to standards he enforced with an impartiality that the staff found formidable, and I had always found privately admirable. He was not a cruel man. He was an exacting one, and there is a difference. He believed in precision, in accountability, in the proper ordering of things. He would have been appalled, I was certain of this, if he had known that the most precise and accountable mind on his entire estate was sitting in the corner of the estate office under a title that had not been accurate for 5 years. But he did not know, because I had not told him, and the longer I did not tell him, the more impossible telling him became, and so I kept my silence, and Miss Fenwick kept her desk, and the estate stayed solvent, and I told myself that this was, on balance, a satisfactory arrangement for all parties. She gave her notice on a Tuesday in November, 7 years and 2 months after she arrived. She set the letter on my desk the same way she set everything on my desk, without drama, squarely centered as if she had measured the margins. She said, I have been offered a position in Creswick with a wool merchants firm that requires a head of accounts. I am to start in the new year. I wanted to give you sufficient notice to arrange a replacement. Then she folded her hands and waited for my answer with the same composure she brought to everything. I said I was sorry to lose her. It was inadequate. I knew it was inadequate. I said it anyway, and she nodded and went back to her desk, and I sat with my letter opener in my hand for a long time and felt very precisely what I had been refusing to feel for 7 years. The Duke was told at dinner, not by me, by the housekeeper, Mrs. Hartwell, who mentioned it in passing as a piece of household news. Lord Edric Valthorpe paused with his wine-glass halfway to the table and said, Which clerk? Mrs. Hartwell said, Miss Fenwick, your grace, in the estate office, the accounts. The Duke said he was not aware there was a Miss Fenwick in the estate office. I said from my end of the table that she had been with us 7 years. He looked at me with that level, measuring look he had, the one that made younger footmen find pressing business elsewhere, and said 7 years. Not a question, an accounting. He asked me after dinner to bring him the current quarterly report. I brought it. It was in her hand, as all the reports were in her hand, but the signature at the bottom was mine, as all the signatures were mine. He read it standing at his desk in the library, all 14 pages of it, and then he set it down and looked at me and said, This is not your style, Aldine. Again, not a question. I said nothing, which was by then a very old habit. He said, Bring me the last 8 reports. I brought them. He read through the night. I know this because I did not sleep, and I could see the library windows lit until well past 3 in the morning from my room in the east wing, and when I came downstairs at 6:30, the candles were burned to their stubs, and the reports were stacked in a precise column on the desk with small slips of paper marking particular pages, and Lord Edric Valthorpe was standing at the window in his coat, which meant he had not been to bed at all. He said without turning around, She saved the estate in the Morley arbitration. I said yes. He said, She identified the Prescott timber arrangement before it went to a second year. I said yes. He said, She has been here 7 years and I have never spoken to her. I said, to my considerable shame, yes. He turned around then. His face was the face of a man who had discovered a precise and specific injustice and was calculating, with the same methodical habit he brought to everything, what was owed and how it must be repaid. He said, What time does the Creswick coach leave from the village? I said 8 o'clock. He looked at the clock on the mantel. It was 10 minutes past 7. He was on horseback and through the east gate in 4 minutes. I know this also because I watched from the library window, and I am not ashamed to say that I felt, watching him go, something very close to the relief of a long-delayed reckoning finally arriving. I was told what happened next by Thomas the groom, who rode out with his grace and witnessed all of it. I have had him tell me 3 times because I find I do not tire of the account. Miss Opal Fenwick was standing on the inn-yard cobbles beside a single trunk, wearing a gray traveling coat, and her customary expression of composed readiness, when the Duke of Valthorpe rode in through the coaching inn's gate at 7 minutes to 8. Thomas said the ostlers and the innkeeper, and 2 other passengers waiting for the Creswick coach all turned to look, because a duke arriving at a gallop is not a common morning occurrence in a village of that size. His grace dismounted, handed Thomas the reins, and walked directly to Miss Fenwick. Thomas said he did not hesitate, did not soften his pace, did not adopt any of the diplomatic obliqueness that powerful men sometimes use when approaching difficult conversations. He walked to her as he walked to everything, directly and with full intention. He said, Miss Fenwick, I have been reading your work, she said. So Thomas reported, Mr. Aldine's reports, your grace. He said, no, your reports, 7 years of them. The Morley arbitration correspondence, the Ray structured drainage proposal, the Prescott timber analysis, the winter summary of 2019 that kept us from an underassessment of £42. All of it yours. I have read your hand for 6 hours. I know your hand. He paused. Thomas said the inn yard was completely quiet. I also know that none of it carries your name. Miss Fenwick said nothing for a moment. Then she said, The arrangement was understood between Mr. Aldine and myself, your grace. I had no complaint of it. He said, I do. Thomas said the Duke's voice was perfectly level when he said it, the way a well-set foundation is level. Nothing to prove, nothing to perform, simply accurate. He said, I have a complaint of it on your behalf and on behalf of 7 years of work that kept this estate solvent and was never once credited to its true author. I intend to correct that. I have already spoken this morning to my solicitor by letter, and the estate accounts will be reattributed correctly in the permanent record. But I am also here because the coach leaves in 6 minutes, and I could not allow you to board it without telling you, in plain terms, what those ledgers told me. Miss Fenwick said, "What did they tell you, Your Grace?" He said that I have had for 7 years the finest financial mind in this county sitting in the corner of my estate office, and I never had the sense to look up from my own affairs and see it. That is my failure and not yours, and I will not dress it otherwise. He stopped. Thomas said he looked briefly like a man choosing his next words with particular care, which Thomas added was unusual for a man who never appeared to find words difficult. Then he said, "I would ask you not to take the Creswick position. I would ask you to come back to Valthorpe, not as a copying clerk, but as head of estate accounts, with full attribution, full authority, and a salary that reflects what you have actually been doing for the past 5 years. And I would ask, though I am aware I have very little right to ask anything of you at present, whether you might be willing to allow me the time to demonstrate that I can see you more clearly than I have done." Thomas said the innkeeper's boy had stopped sweeping the yard entirely. The other passengers had forgotten they were waiting for a coach. The ostlers had found reasons to linger near the gate. Miss Fenwick looked at the Duke of Valthorpe for what Thomas estimated was a long 10 seconds. Then she said, "You have read 7 years of my ledgers in a single night, Your Grace." "That is thorough, even by your standards," he said. "I am aware it is rather late," she said. "It is. But then, some ledgers take longer to open than others. She did not board the Creswick coach. I will record only one further detail, because I think it is the one that matters most, and because Thomas made a point of telling it to me separately, as a thing he wished to make sure I knew. When the Duke handed Miss Fenwick's trunk up to his groom to be carried back to Valthorpe Hall, he said to her, 'I should like to know, if you are willing to tell me, what it was like to do the work well and have no one say your name.' She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, 'It was like keeping a very careful set of accounts that no one else could read. The numbers were always right. I always knew they were right. I suppose I thought that was enough.' He said it was never enough. It should have been said. Your name should have been said." He offered her his arm for the walk to the horses. "It will be said now, as often as you will allow me." She took his arm. They walked out of the inn yard together under a pale November sky, past the ostlers and the innkeeper's boy and the other passengers, none of whom looked away. And that is how Miss Opal Fenwick, who had kept the Duke of Valthorpe's ledgers in silence for 7 years, became the woman whose name he said first, last, and in every room he entered for the rest of his life. I know, because I was there for all of it, and because, for the record, I am very glad to have been wrong about what rather meant.